Our nation, not just the Navy, not just the Joint Force, the entire nation is having a conversation about those ground combat exclusion policies. They're not law in the United States, they're policies that exclude women from serving in units that have a mission of ground combat, that might be exposed to ground combat. Well, you know, anyone who picks up the newspaper from Afghanistan, guess what? Women are already in ground combat. There are no lines anymore. Many of you have been there, you've served there, you know that.
Vice Admiral Carol Pottinger is with the United States Navy. She's Deputy Chief of Staff for Capability and Development at NATO Headquarters, Supreme Allied Command and Transformation. Carol is our keynote speaker and will speak for 15 minutes. If I can ask Vice Admiral Pottinger to open the conference. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Madeline. Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. I also had an awesome time last night. I think it was General Dempsey that said he had no idea he'd ever be in a place like that. I didn't know he was going to sing. I'm not going to sing for you. Sorry. But it was a great event. The women I met there are just amazing women from such a variety of careers and walks of life. So I know we're going to have a vibrant discussion over here the next couple of days, and that's what I hope for. I'm supposed to talk for about 15 minutes. I want to keep it to that, no more. Kind of like General Dempsey said last night, I don't want to stand up here talking. I want discussion. We all want discussion. We want Q&A. We want to get your perspectives and ideas. You may have noticed in the program the title of my little talk here was Perspectives from a Senior Military Leader in NATO Who Happens to be Female. So the important part of that phrase is the front part, Senior Military Leader. And the back part is kind of what we're here to talk about a little bit, who happens to be female. I noticed, it was interesting to me as I went through the program, there's actually a couple of us that ended up with that same title and same theme. So if you look at us, if you listen to us today and tomorrow, understand from those of us who aren't in the seat now, who aren't those senior female leaders, for the men in the room, for the junior women in the room, that's how we look at ourselves. We look at ourselves as leaders who happen to be female. And it drives perspectives. It certainly creates some of who we are, some of the way we lead, some of our personality traits, some of our reasons for our own success. But you know, that is the bottom line. We are leaders. You're looking at a bunch of incredible leaders across so many fields here today and tomorrow, and I think it's going to be great to listen to all of your stories. You're all pioneers. I'm a pioneer, so are every one of you. So for me, there's two target audiences here today. The young women here today, who I'm delighted you're here. I think it's a wonderful chance for us to share our stories with you and maybe give you some tips that might help you along your way. So I would just like to recognize those young women, both in the military and young women in defense and security sector who made the time and travel to come here today and be with us. Would you all just stand up for a minute so we can see who you are? Come on, stand up. All right, great. Great. Good luck to all of you. You've got great careers ahead. The other target audience, and I think our director Rusi mentioned this, are the policymakers and shapers here today. And I'm not going to make you stand up. But you really, I hope, are here to learn, listen and learn, just as the young women are. But also, you may be perhaps skeptical about what it is we're talking about. You know, the director said this issue. Well, what is this issue? You know, what is it that is the aim of these couple of days? What are the opinion shapers, the opinions that we're trying to shape you to understand better? So from that context, that's mostly what I'm going to talk about this morning, to share with you what I learned in my U.S. Navy, why we made decisions we did, how that impacted our progress to create opportunity for women to serve. And then, again, let's have some spirited Q&A. If we don't have a discussion with you, we're wasting our time. You said push the envelope. What are the things that we really need to pinpoint, to change, to transform, to reach for that future? So let's have that hard conversation today with those Chatham House rules when we get to the Q&A. So I started Purdue University in 1973. Been in the Navy, the military, longer than many of the young women who just stood up have been alive, 35 years in uniform. Back when I started in Navy ROTC at Purdue University, there were only 4 universities in the United States that were even open to women ROTC. Academies were not open. I had 4 women in my class with me. At the time, we couldn't even do things like go on midshipman cruises on ships because women couldn't stay overnight at sea. Our assignment policies were very restricted for after commissioning. And frankly, something some of the women in the audience who are in uniform will understand, our uniforms were very oddly and poorly constructed. We've made progress on some of those issues. On the uniform issue, we're still working at it 35 years later. And you laugh, but it's true. It's just an aspect of service that we continue to press on and help the leadership understand why these things are important. But at the same time, even at that very early age, I felt very privileged to serve. I was part of an elite group. I was honored to wear the uniform. I was going to be able to serve my country. And this really meant so much to me as a patriot and as someone who felt that I had something to give and wanted that opportunity to give it. 73, a lot of women in here, some women in here are as old as me. You know, what could you do back then? You could be a teacher, you could be a nurse, or if you really wanted a glamorous career, you could be a flight attendant. So those were the career choices. Yet here I was in a program that was going to let me be commissioned and go serve and lead sailors. Though not yet, not when I was commissioned in 77. Again, academies opened in 76, so in 77 we were really the first wave of women coming from a commissioning source that before had only produced men to that date. So my first tour of duty was in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, as a communications watch officer. You might say, what's wrong with that? It's a pretty good tour, a great time, but it wasn't operational. It wasn't front line. And so this is one of the key themes that I want to talk about a little bit today, that I firmly believe and advocate that in order to permit women the opportunity to serve and compete, they have to be able to have access to all of the assignments that are available in a service, in an organization, in an industry, on a faculty, I don't care what it was. So the Navy did open ships in 1978. I think our Navy really did lead the way in a lot of ways. But the ships that they opened were tenders, big repair ships who hadn't deployed for years. They were welded to the pier is how we looked at it. We didn't know that. We were going to sea. We were going to be division officers afloat. We were going to compete with our peers. We thought this is awesome. We didn't understand that these were the backwater ships, that it wasn't a huge culture development for the Navy to open these ships to women because they weren't the sexy destroyers. You know, they weren't the aircraft carriers. And so we could kind of slip in under the horizon there and go serve on these ships, and no one would really notice. That's okay. You know, you got to open the door somewhere. You had to start somewhere. Years rolled on, continued to serve. Barrier after barrier fell down in the Navy. Our supply ships opened in the late 80s, where I commanded at sea twice in the 80s and 90s. In the mid-90s, the U.S. Navy opened all combatants to women. As long as berthing requirements could be managed, and that's, if you want to talk about that in the Q&A, I think that's an important aspect for the military, especially on ships where you do have to deploy 4 months on end. And in 2006, I headed out to Japan to command 8 ships as the first female flag to command a strike group in our Navy. I commanded Expeditionary Strike Group 7 out of Okinawa, Japan. Same thing for the U.S. Navy in flight, rotary wing jets. Everything really started to break open in the 90s. In 2008, I took command of our Navy's expeditionary forces, 40,000 sailors, our EOD, our CBs, maritime security, cargo handlers, including our riverine force, which today still remains one of the few remaining forces in our Navy that is not open to women because of our ground combat exclusion policies. So just think about it. I could command 40,000 sailors in NECC, but one of the forces I commanded, women could not participate in. So a little bit of an oxymoron there. So again, I've been in the service for 35 years, And I've learned a lot about equal opportunity, but I don't personally care for that phrase. And let me tell you what I mean. I would reword it a little. I would say, how does an organization, how did my Navy create an environment of opportunity for women to succeed? It's not about entitlement. Success doesn't get handed to anyone, but you have to have the environment to succeed. You can only earn success if you have the opportunity to compete on a fair basis, to showcase your talents, to work hard, and to be recognized and rewarded within the normal boundaries of that organization. So I think this is perhaps my first key point today for those influence makers and shakers. Equal opportunity for success, not just equal opportunity for equal opportunity's sake. That's really what I think we're talking about. Now, I don't deny my Navy's journey may have started on the former, may have started with equal opportunity as, it's fair, it's right, it's the right thing to do, but at the end of the day, for military, it doesn't cut it. That's not the rationale to talk about. The rationale that I use is readiness. It's all about readiness. And you'll hear this mantra repeated by most senior military officers in the United States. This is our journey. This is what we've discovered. If you're going to recruit and retain the best and the brightest, you can't afford to ignore half your population. You can't afford to ignore half your high school graduates. You can't afford to ignore half your college graduates or your graduate school graduates. For the U.S. government, for the U.S. Joint Force, our eligible population of recruits gets smaller every year. A lot of our youth have medical issues, asthma. A lot of our youth are obese. A lot of our youth have prior drug use. They aren't eligible for military service. So as you get a smaller and smaller population to recruit and retain those best and brightest, again, you can't ignore half, 50% of your population, which is the women. So it really is all about readiness, force preparedness, force capability, which is why in my job today as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Capability Development for ACT, Allied Command Transformation, which is the NATO command that helps the alliance look over the horizon and figure out how to develop and deliver the capabilities of the future. This is a very appropriate theme in my day job, as well as obviously something I'm very passionate about from my own experience. And I'm not sure how much that axiom, it's all about readiness, really differs from any other organization, not just the military. And let me tell you why I say that. The U.S. Navy has learned from some industries, some companies that have worked very hard on their diversity policies, but they have many challenges as well. I recently read a report about a several years long research effort sponsored by McKinsey and Company. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the international conglomerate that does a lot of strategic business consulting for major corporations. And it struck me how similar to the military the challenges that came out of that report were. Again, thousands of interviews over many years, 5 years I think McKinsey's been doing this. Here's what some of the results are. Consistently show that although women start careers in business and other professions with the same levels of intelligence, education, and commitment as men, comparatively few reach the top echelons of corporate governance. McKinsey reports that out of those thousands of interviews, 2 main barriers were identified that were preventing women from reaching top management positions. The first one was called the double burden syndrome. For professional women, the combination of work and domestic responsibilities, childbearing, child rearing. And the second one was the anytime, anywhere availability syndrome. The need for senior executives to be ready to travel anywhere, live anywhere, be completely geographically mobile, which to me is probably tied to the first one, childbearing and child raising. Interestingly, women respondents indicated a third barrier very consistently throughout these thousands of interviews, the reticence of women to advocate for themselves. So I think this is something that we also could talk about during the Q&A, because I think it's a pretty important theme for especially our young women to understand. You have to advocate for yourselves. You have to have that confidence in yourselves and your capabilities to stand up and be ready to go stretch and push and take assignments that maybe you feel you're not quite ready for. And there's a lot of stories out there about that, about how men will step forward and say, yep, put me in, coach. And women will say, no, I don't want to disappoint you. I'm not sure I'm ready. I really want to do the best job for you I can. So, maybe you should pick somebody else this time around. I'll be ready next time. Knock it off. Just get out there and do it. So the study recommended a dozen or so measures. This is, again, oriented toward corporations, but it's absolutely apropos to my military experience. A couple of measures that companies must take to level the playing field to make that opportunity to succeed available to women. The top two are points 2 and 3. Advocacy from the top, from the CEO, from the Chief of Service, from the Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Boy, that was some great advocacy from the top that we heard in his remarks last night. The second one is establishing a formal sponsorship program where senior executives take on junior women and actively sponsor them, mentor them, advise them, help them reach for those positions that will make them credible in the eyes of company leadership and their peers. So these are essentially the same two measures that I have seen my Navy take aboard and take seriously, especially in the past decade. We haven't gotten it all right either. I think the first 20 or so years, frankly, my time, 77 to the mid-90s, it was kind of hit and miss. We didn't really have our eye on a goal. We just felt like we needed to move forward and open up some things and make some opportunity available, but there's no consistency, no end game in mind, as I like to say. And it's really been just the last 10 years that there's been that proactive advocacy from my Navy's leadership, from our previous chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, to lean forward and embrace the policies and the culture to create that workplace that supports women in uniform. And it's been done with active mentoring as well, and I'm going to give you a couple examples of that. So I was just thrilled to hear General Dempsey last night. I don't know him personally. I knew Admiral Mullen very well. And I'm going to tell you about an initiative that we're doing in NATO that I've asked General Dempsey to come speak at next summer along this very theme. So for the Navy, some outcomes. In my 35 years, population for women has increased 300%. We now comprise about 16% of our Navy, which is a pretty significant number. Largest percentage of women in ROTC in the U.S. Naval Academy ever. 93% of all billets, all assignments are open to women at this point in the Navy. Even of our SEAL community, which is one of the communities that has remained closed, our Navy Special Warfare, we've had hundreds of women deployed in support capacities in intel and supply and others on the front lines with our SEALs. And our SEAL leadership openly talks about the time coming near when they will open to women, when they will actively recruit women. We've instituted longer and more predictable shore tours in between sea tours to promote family planning. This is kind of the third rail for the military, back to the McKinsey results about women still carrying the primary responsibility for bearing. Actually, they have the only responsibility for bearing children. I don't think that's going to change in our lifetime or any lifetime. But also the primary responsibility for raising children. So if you're going to, again, create that workplace, that environment of opportunity to succeed, you have to have policies in place that let women know they can have it all. They can have a career and they can have a family. Now, we still struggle with this. We still lose a lot of our great women officers. Some women enlisted, mostly are young women officers coming up through the academy, through flight school, through surface warfare school, because they just aren't sure how to balance that work family, and they want to have the family, and in many cases they want to have the career. So we work very hard on this, and we're making progress. One of the ways is through that predictable seashore rotation. We've got sabbaticals, we've got some other venues and some policy advocacy that permit them to understand that they can find that balance. And I think one of my favorite examples was when I was the commander of our Navy Expeditionary Combat Command that I mentioned. I was out in the North Arabian Gulf a year or two ago visiting some of my forces, and I had to get up to the OPLATs. I'm sure many of you have been up in the NAG there on the oil platforms, ABOT and KOT. My forces were the maritime forces guarding those platforms, and I had to lily pad on the way on a DDG that was sitting up there doing duty up in the NAG. And I got aboard the ship and met by the XO. It was a woman XO. She's getting ready to fleet up to be the CO of the ship, and I was just chatting with her as we're heading over to the boat, and she said, yeah, I have 5 children. I was like, what? You have 5 children. You're out here in the North Arabian Gulf, XO, getting ready to be CO of a ship, and you've got 5 kids at home. I was like, that's awesome. How do you do it? And she just told me how she, her family care and her husband and great support network and all of that stuff. And so it can be done. And these are the types of examples that I think are really important for our military women to see, to understand that it's hard. It's always hard, but it's possible. She found a way. And for organizations that are committed to being an employer of choice, this is language that my Navy is using the last couple of years. We want to be an employer of choice. You must institute policies that give those professional women, who are also wives and mothers, a shot at that brass ring. So we also sponsor female leadership symposiums to foster networking and share success stories. This networking piece is, again, something that is very elementary to men in business, especially in the military, especially to take care of each other, to watch over each other, to see opportunities, to spot chances for someone to go be touted, to be promoted. Women are still learning how to do this. So we sponsor symposiums throughout our Navy to offer workshops, to bring speakers in, and to talk about how you do that. And last year in San Diego, we had over 1,300 women in uniform from all of our joint services, probably the largest gathering of women in uniform in the history of the world. It was really awesome. It was very motivational, very inspiring. We have Facebook pages, so we're doing everything we can in terms of offering that leadership advocacy and that mentoring opportunity from the top for women in our Navy and across much of our joint force. We can talk about the Marine Corps if you want during the Q&A. For the Navy, first women to be signed to submarines reported this month. So, finally, the last big barrier for the United States Navy, women on subs, is gone. They've been in training for about a year. They reported earlier in November. And why did the submarine force do that? Because they realized that in a community, in order to maintain the caliber of their workforce, which is a very challenging and technical environment, they had to open up opportunity to women because they weren't able to sustain the caliber that they needed with just bringing men in the door. It's all about readiness. Okay, it's the bottom line. They did the math. They're nukes. They're smart. The math said, here's what we got to do. So it took longer than maybe it had to, but I'm very, really thrilled and proud of our Navy that we did that. So a couple more essential policy changes for military forces that are thinking about going down this path. Again, if women cannot serve in the same assignments as men at sea, in the air, boots on the ground, in submarines, we cannot compete fairly for promotions or for that next milestone job. So that's such a critical part of this. A second essential policy must shape those promotion mechanisms. For the Navy, the way that we did that was we started providing through our selection board precepts, our guidelines to a selection board where you go behind closed doors and you brief records and you vote anonymously for someone to be selected for promotion to a rank or for selection to command a ship or an aircraft squadron. In our precepts, we started putting language that said, you cannot disadvantage someone who has not in the past had the same opportunity as their peers to compete. You have to look at their record based on their potential to serve and based on how they did in the assignments that they had. So this was directly targeted, and none of my comments are meant to be offensive or antagonistic. It's just fact. This was directly targeted at the white male members of boards. Most of my Navy is still white male, who by default tend to pick other candidates who look like them. That's what I did, that's good. That's where I served, that guy's good. Well, for many decades, women didn't have the opportunity to look like them. Their records didn't look like them. So we had to put those guidelines in there to force them a little bit to understand how they needed to stop picking ducks. We call it ducks picking ducks. It's just a little label that we have. And it works. It worked and it works. And it was never about quotas. Absolutely not about quotas. Never about not picking best qualified. We always pick best and most fully qualified in our boards. But it was about just changing that cultural environment a little bit to help paint the full picture of the potential of these candidates. One final aspect that to me cannot be underrated in this whole conversation. Junior personnel need to be able to look up the ladder, look up the chain of command, and see people that look like themselves. This is kind of the reverse of guys looking down and saying, ducks pick ducks. These are women looking up and saying, well, I don't see anybody who looks like me in senior leadership positions, so I guess there's no place for me in this organization. And again, I think this is not just applicable to military forces. And I've had too much experience with this to not deny that it is ground truth. Everywhere I go, women will cluster, they'll gather, they'll corner me on a bridge wing, they'll come up after an event, and they'll say, boy, I have never met a female flag officer before. I mean, there's 34 of us now. That's not a lot, but you'd think we'd get around a little bit more because it doesn't matter where I go. They say, I have never met a Navy female flag officer before. And it helps them to consider their own future from a different lens. They can say to themselves, I can do that too. It's really, I think, a critical aspect. And some other kind of turning points, I think I would call them, again, led by that CEO advocacy, led by leadership advocacy. A couple years ago, our chief of the service got all women flag officers together. First time we'd ever done that. We were like, oh my God, what are the guys going to think? What are they talking about behind those closed doors? Are they talking about us? What's going on? It was very powerful, and we really had a chance to focus in on the specific challenges and barriers for women to serve. But it was the first time that had ever happened. There were 21 of us. This was, I think, when I was a new flag in 2006 or something like that. Just a couple weeks ago, we had a second, what we called a summit, a flag summit with all our female flag officers. Now we're up to 34. So the numbers themselves tell a story. But the fact that the Secretary of the Navy came to talk to us, our Chief of Service came to talk to us, again, that leadership advocacy was there as well. They understand the readiness equation. You won't find a single senior leader in our Navy out on the stumps today talking to audiences without them talking about this aspect of how important diversity is to the future of our force, to the success, to the readiness, to the preparedness of our military. So that's all good news. Doesn't mean we're done. Good story to tell so far, but our journey isn't over. You may not be aware, our nation, not just the Navy, not just the Joint Force, the entire nation is having a conversation about those ground combat exclusion policies. They're not law in the United States, they're policies that exclude women from serving in units that have a mission of ground combat that might be exposed to ground combat. Well, anyone who picks up the newspaper from Afghanistan, guess what? Women are already in ground combat. There are no lines anymore. Many of you have been there, you've served there, you know that. So as this gets debated, as this dialogue happens, we need our senior leaders like General Dempsey, like the opinion makers, the fact makers in this room, the policy makers in this room, to understand, hey, that's in the rearview mirror. Women have already done those jobs, and they've obviously proven that it is about readiness, that they bring capability, perspective to the fight that battle commanders absolutely need to get the mission done. And it was interesting to me to hear General Dempsey, because I found out earlier the evening, as he said, that he's got 2 daughters and 1 son. It's amazing how fathers who are senior leaders with daughters seem to learn this and actually understand the implications and the context of this whole conversation. So shifting gears for just a moment, I was asked to talk a little bit about what I'm doing in NATO, and part of what I've been talking about so far directly leads me to my next couple of minutes here. So I've been in my job for about 19 months, and until this forum, in all my travels to Brussels, throughout Europe, I've been in almost every NATO nation, many partner nations. I had never met another female flag general officer. Now, they obviously exist. They're here today. I had never met them in all my conversations, discussions, meetings with senior military. I've only met a handful of women at the colonel captain level. I've only met one until last night, one senior female enlisted member in Oberammergau going through a senior enlisted leadership course. So I think in Europe, it appears that there's a lot of women in politics, a lot of women in government, but I don't see that carrying over into many militaries. And there's some, certainly, but in terms of the opportunity that I'm talking about, I think that we have some opportunity in Europe's military. Certainly, I'm not saying we're done in the U.S. We're absolutely not. I already told you that. I think there's some opportunity in Europe's militaries to have this conversation about readiness, especially as many Europe's and many NATO militaries move from a conscript to a volunteer force. Going to recruit and retain the best and the brightest. You can't ignore half your population. Even in times of downsizing, shrinking, deficits, budgets, all of those challenges that we face. So one of the ways that I'm doing that, some of you may know that last March I was directed by all the NATO defense ministers to stand up a task force to try to bring groups of nations together to develop capabilities. We called it the Multinational Approaches Task Force. So we worked all summer, came up with about 40 concrete initiatives that we brought to ministers in their October ministerial, and a couple of hundred second-tier initiatives that we're still working on in terms of bringing to fruition. And all of this work will continue forward to be delivered in the Chicago Summit next May as part of something called Smart Defense. I'm going to talk a little bit about Smart Defense here in a moment. So we reported to ministers to October, offering those 40 concrete proposals. One of those proposals was focused squarely on this aspect of increasing opportunity for women in defense and security. In fact, we came up with this before I even knew that RUSI did these conferences. So I was thrilled to know that RUSI is on this and understands the critical nature of this. So we put that out there. A nation stepped forward to lead. Bulgaria is leading this initiative. Deputy Defense Minister of Bulgaria is a woman. That's fine, whatever it takes. And all of the nations in the SEDM, the Southeast Defense Ministerial, have all signed up to tackle this issue about creating a climate of opportunity for women in their defense and security sectors. So we're going to start with a seminar next summer. I asked General Dempsey if he would come speak. I'm looking at other high-level speakers addressed to the policymakers. This is the purpose of this first senior leader seminar next summer. Let's talk to the policymakers from NATO, the deputy CHODs, the deputy ministers. We're not sure what level yet, but that's our target audience, and that's the conversation we're going to have. So a little bit about smart defense, and then I'll get off the stage here. Let me just offer you a quote from Secretary General. And I think the reason that you all would be interested in this, and you've probably read a little bit about it in the press, maybe seen some of Secretary General's speeches, we're all facing severe fiscal climates. Again, look at what happened in the U.S. last week in our Congress and going into sequestration. We don't know what that means to our defense budget, but it means less money. So Secretary General, here's a quote from a speech that he gave just a month or so ago. "I know that in an age of austerity, we cannot spend more, but neither should we spend less. So the answer is to spend better and to get better value for money, to help nations to preserve capabilities and to deliver new ones. This means we must prioritize, we must specialize, and we must seek multinational solutions." So those kind of three components of smart defense, prioritize, specialize, multinational solutions, which we now are calling cooperation, are the three tenets of smart defense as we move forward on this effort. And ACT is leading a great deal of this work. We're not leading smart defense. It's being led by the Secretary General, but ACT is helping to conceptualize smart defense, to help nations figure out what we can do better in terms of prioritization, specialization, and cooperation. And we're continuing to help put this package of specific initiatives together to take to Chicago. So both of these are going to be on the summit agenda for heads of state and government in Chicago. My boss, General Admiral, has been selected by Secretary General as a special envoy. He's been going around to visit all the capitals in NATO, along with the Deputy Secretary General, to talk to, at the ministerial level, at the CHOD level, about smart defense. And I think, many of you realize that a lot of this is coming out of Secretary Gates' comment when he left office last spring, where he said, the U.S. is bringing a huge percentage of capability to the alliance. We need Europe to step up, excuse me, to step up to the plate a little bit more. So certainly that's one of the focuses, but the real focus is that we can deliver capabilities better and more cost effectively, and we need to do that as an alliance, in partnership, in cooperation. We don't have to do everything at 28 nations. We can do things at smaller groups of nations, and we can better prioritize what those capabilities need to be, and we can better specialize with some nations offering strengths that other nations might not have. So that's very quick and dirty, and if you have more questions, we can certainly do it in the Q&A and go from there. So I had some other examples here about what ACT is doing in terms of capability development. I think I'll skip those. We're doing a lot. Faster, better, cheaper. This is my mantra as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Capability Development. How can we deliver capabilities to the alliance faster, better, cheaper? Whether it's with industry, whether, again, it's through multinational cooperation, whatever the approach is, de-risking technologies. We're looking at all of those aspects. We're putting things into place through NATO's defense planning process. So a very important focus for me in my day job. And again, force capability, that's part of my day job. That's why I'm here this week. Some of the other aspects that I'm looking at with force capability is how can NATO nations use their reserve forces better? How can NATO nations use their NCO corps better? So these are all tied together, and offering opportunity for women to serve in the military is not over here. It's dead center to this entire conversation that we're having about capability for our great alliance. So on that note, let me end, and thanks for your time.
Thank you.